Andy, we're less than a week away from almighty holidays coming up, big days coming up.
Yeah.
How are you? How are you on the holiday shopping? Are you good? Are you
I think I'm mission complete, Dave. I think
okay?
I think I'm complete, and I think the Amazon Pelicans and whatever else is used to deliver various items from Amazon and everybody else that I've ordered stuff from. I think everybody has delivered. I'm feeling pretty confident at this point, so it might be too late to think otherwise, to be honest. So I'm feeling pretty good. How about you?
I'm likewise also good. I have a couple little odds and ends that I'm always going to go back and kind of tweak. It's nothing I need, but if I can find it, it's great. Um, Andy, have you noticed? I don't know if you're a big Amazon shopper, but
Oh yeah.
Amazon started putting things in clear plastic bags and dropping them off. Now, whether that's the only problem with this, and it's mostly around clothing, of course. The only problem is if that's a gift.
Yeah.
Now you've exposed the gift potentially if you're not at home to receive it, and maybe someone else in the family does. I bought an ugly sweater, a Christmas ugly sweater. We had that one of those things going on, and it was quite beautiful. And so, my wife, not that I was hiding it from my wife or anything, but she immediately knew what it was. She's like, "This is amazing," and so, all good and wonderful things. So, but
These are definitely the easiest of problems to have to deal with in life, I think, right? If our biggest problems are our gifts are coming in clear bags, we're doing pretty good, Dave. So Merry Christmas to you and your clear bag struggles. I appreciate it.
Yeah, for sure, for sure. So, Andy, I do want to also announce, hey, we are on YouTube, so you can find us on the Men of a Certain X YouTube channel. We're going to try to post some clips on here. We're going to try to take some pauses, breaks on our podcast that allow for better editing because we're not experts at this. If anybody loves to do editing, we'd love to have you work in partnership with us. We don't have much to offer, maybe a penny or two here or there, but we are on YouTube, so check us out. We'll probably get these clips on. We'll post them on our socials as well. But Andy, if you were talking about problems to have around the holiday season, somebody has a big problem, or potentially a big problem. You want to cue the transition music, Andy?
Well done,
Oh,
Dave.
man, that is beautiful. Beautiful transition. Andy, so yesterday the Supreme Court made history with, I'll just read from the news article, unprecedented freeze in your tracks ruling that former President Donald Trump is constitutionally ineligible to run in 2024 because the 14th Amendment's ban on insurrectionists holding public office covers his conduct on January 6, 2021. It was a 4-3 decision, Andy. I don't want to get into all the details. What are your immediate takeaways or thoughts on this ruling?
Well, I mean, first, it's a political decision in that it's affecting politics, and it's going to be highly politicized, as a the world against Trump kind of thing from his side for sure. We're going to hear a lot about it, and it's going to work its way to the Supreme Court, I think, in rapid speed because I think it has to. But it's really interesting, right? I mean, um, a similar issue was raised in Minnesota, and I think failed last month. It's never been used before in the history of the United States, right? Post Civil War, it wasn't used because those that fought in the South in the Civil War and were political leaders didn't run, right? They recognized that they weren't going to be part of the future of the Union. In Trump's case, right, he did, and so he's being challenged. Look, by the definition, you can look up the 14th Amendment. You can look up Section 3. It basically, I mean, I'll just give you some short passage of it. Um, any member of basically holding elected office, we'll say, just to keep it simple, um, shall have engaged in insurrection or rebellion against the United States. I'm paraphrasing, or given aid or comfort to the enemies thereof. Cannot run for office. Right? Cannot hold office, civil or military, under the United States. Right. So the question really comes down to, was what occurred on January 6th insurrection? And that, there's going to be those that support Trump will say no. Those that do not support Trump will say maybe yes. And you're seeing that, right now people are screaming on both sides. It's going to be discussed, and it's going to go to the Supreme Court, and they're going to rule. My sensing is that they will rule in favor of the former president, and that he will remain on the ballot. I don't think he'll be removed by the courts. Personally, I agree with the courts. I think it was
Yeah.
insurrection. I don't think he should be allowed to run on those grounds, but I don't think it'll hold up. And at the end of the day, to be honest with you, probably better for democracy and America's future for him to, if he is a nominee, which he might not be, to lose in the ballot box and to lose because of a court decision. I think that's just very problematic in different ways.
Yeah, I mean, you've already got all of these the Trump army is politicized everything, and they've politicized the FBI. You know, they've accused the FBI of being Joe Biden's FBI, and now the courts will be Joe Biden's courts. Unfortunately, you know, the former president doesn't have a leg on the U.S. Supreme Court because he's appointed many of those judges, and
Yeah.
so it'd be interesting to see how. And it is a heavily conservative court. I think it's 6-3. So I mean, it certainly stands in his favor. I do tend to agree with you, Andy, that I would prefer that he not be ruled ineligible from the courts and let it go to the ballot boxes where the people can decide, and that's less controversial for many people, and I think that would be better overall for democracy to work. We'll see how this plays out, but it is certainly not the last we'll hear for this. It
Yeah.
just adds to Trump's legal problems, and maybe to continue um, his shtick against everybody's against me, the witch hunt is on. But Andy, before we move on to some other political topics, anything else on this? Anything worth calling out?
Well, I'll just say, it shows the interesting time we're in because, again, I agree with the court's ruling. I mean, candidly, I don't Mr. Trump would have vacated office if he didn't have to. I think he would have liked to have held on to it. And if he could have, I think he would have. I agree that it was insurrection. I agree that by the terms of our Constitution, he should be barred. It's kind of a sad statement to say that I think for the large part, like we don't feel that it's a safe decision to keep him off the ballot because of that, because it's dangerous. And that's kind of a scary thought that,
Yeah.
to allow the process to continue as it currently is out of somewhat fear of what could be if it goes down this legal path. Like we shouldn't be in that situation, right? But that's exactly why the 14th Amendment was written the way it was, right? It's exactly for situations like this. So, at the end of the day, if the Supreme Court were to rule against Mr. Trump, it is a court he basically put together.
Right.
It would be very interesting how it plays out. I tell you, I would not feel safe for those justices. We see threats to the FBI. A gentleman from Arizona just arrested this week or last week. We're seeing a lot of elected officials being threatened. I would not feel safe for that Supreme Court. But at the end of the day, to be honest with you, they're there to make these tough decisions. It will be interesting to see how they go because this is a very consequential case for the United States. So it's interesting to see how it happens. So we'll watch it play out, Dave. But definitely strange times we're in, here in
Yeah.
2023.
Yeah, and I do want to be clear. I do support the decision as well. I mean, I do believe it was an insurrection. I don't believe there's any debate over that. Obviously, people recently the U.S. House of Representatives released a bunch of information or the videos around this, and people have been dissecting it. And I agree with releasing the videos, but again, it opens up to those conspiracy theorists who go, "Hey, at the 1 hour 59-second mark." This happens, but
Yeah.
we saw that same person on the it opens it up to a lot of different things, but I do agree ultimately where we're at on that. So Andy, do you want to cue the transition side again? All right, this is Politics Wednesday, so we are going to go through a couple key headlines that have come out on the political front. Obviously, the elections are really spinning up really good here, Andy. There's a lot of things that are coming out. All the celebrities are coming out. There's a lot of activities that are being done. I'm going to run through the headlines and let's just comment briefly on each of these. Andy, I'll just start at the front here. The New York Post reported Roseanne Barr leaves America Fest crowd stunned with unhinged rants about communists and Nazis. Andy, where are you going to go with this one here?
I mean, one, I think, I don't care what Roseanne Barr should say on anything, right? I mean, she was an entertaining comedian for a while. She was loud and obnoxious, and America enjoyed it for a while. She had a fun show, but she's always been kind of unhinged, and I think all the more so in sort of her rants, very aligned with former President Mr. Trump and what she says, and just very sort of crazy. So, I don't care for what she has to say. Don't really care politically what she has to say. I'm more interested in what my neighbor has to say on politics than I am about Roseanne Barr. So I, I I don't care, Dave.
Yeah, I don't much care either. I find it interesting that these people who are, uh, days gone past and their time is well off the limelight, somehow find a way, and somehow we're supposed to give them any sort of due deference or somehow attribute that we care what Roseanne Barr thinks. But I agree wholeheartedly. Andy had a similar at the America Fest thing. There was also a headline of a black gay Republican heckled with slurs at the event. This is a Army veteran. He shared some video on X, also known as Twitter, about an incident that occurred in Phoenix where they gathered for this America Fest, that 4-day event. So, Andy, anything to add with that additional information? Thoughts on this?
No, I mean it's sad to see. It's not surprising. I mean, look, I don't think that everybody that supports Mr. Trump or every conservative is a racist, which is a brush that people like to paint at times. I think it's very unfair to do that. It's completely not true, but that there are elements that are racist and anti-gay and anti everything else, like that's true. I think the concerning thing is that those individuals feel that it's okay to yell out, racial slurs or homophobic slurs, whatever it is, in public. That's a concern, right? I mean, that's not a good thing. And I think the reality is we are in a time today where sort of that aggressive extremist voice is empowered, emboldened, and feels like it is okay to do and say those things. That's a concern, right? That's a concern. But again, I want to be cautious because I think a lot of people like to sort of throw out there that so and so is a racist, a homophobe, whatever, and some people genuinely are. I definitely think people have to pause and not use that broad stroke and suggest that everybody supports Trump as a racist. People support Trump for a number of reasons. Some of them are genuine out of love of country. We might disagree politically, but it's a concern. But in this instance, we're really unfortunate to see but it's reality. That's where we are. There was a cross being burned in a black family's lawn in South Carolina. That
Yep.
came into it's just, that's still happening. Some people feel like it is a time where they can do that safely, and that's sad.
Yeah, it is. And of course, the Republican Party has continually tried to bring in that they're an all-inclusive party. And when you get these things that happen, obviously there are LGBTQ plus individuals who are Republicans. There are, obviously a lot of minorities who are Republicans. But when you see something like this happen, it then gets those headlines, those attention-grabbing headlines. And so that is interesting to see as well. But let's move on to another topic, Andy. This one more so around recently Politico put out. Yeah, obviously we all saw the headlines from last week about, or the week prior, where Trump was talking. He wouldn't be a dictator except for day one, Andy.
Yeah.
He'd only be the dictator for day one. And he was going to do certain things on day one. But Politico looked back over Trump's time and looked at his praise of authoritarian figures, especially when he was in office. He, boasted about his relationships with North Korea, obviously with Vladimir Putin. And then he talked a lot about how his hard, aggressive stance were with China and such, and because they had a mutual degree of respect. He uses very strong language that does hearken to what authoritarian leaders typically do. I don't think there's any confusion there what Trump wants to be, and I think I've said on this podcast previously that my big concern is that in the first Trump presidency, he had a lot of savvy political individuals. Now they all didn't last long. I mean, he rotated them through, but he had a good chief of staff. Generally, he had key people in key positions, but those people left. And
Yeah.
this time, I think it's going to just be reinforced by people who just want to give Trump what he wants and allow those things to happen. So that's my take on that. Andy, any thoughts on the authoritarian viewpoint from Trump?
Yeah, I mean, I think I mean, there's two things happening. I mean, one, that he says some things are complimentary or not, not hostile. I mean, some of that is going to occur with almost everyone, right? I mean, even while meeting with China's president recently, while Mr. Biden called him a dictator, he also was very cozy and friendly with him. That's what world leaders have to do, right? It's a weird, relationship you have to maintain. So to some extent, you can say, well, he's trying to maintain relationships, and he's trying to break down barriers with North Korea, for example. And in some level, there's goodness in that. But right, but in Mr. Trump's case, he seems to be very comfortable with wielding a lot of power and authority from the White House, right? And if given the opportunity to take on more power and authority from the White House, everything he said and does suggests he would gladly do that, right? And that's dangerous because it takes our branches of government out of balance. It's, if given the opportunity to be king, would Mr. Trump be king? I think he would. I mean, I was listening, recently to some commentary about the potential of him, Mr. Trump, trying to organize a constitutional convention if you're reelected to allow himself to run for a third term. I think things like that are very possible. I mean, he got an ego, the size of the United States. I think he would serve as long as he possibly could, and I think he would do everything he could to hold power, where he is, and bypass Congress and the courts and everything else. So, on one hand, I think you can argue it's some level of diplomacy, which is reasonable. On the other hand, I think he's opened his Komodo, many times and said, I like authority, power, and I would also like to be, an authoritarian dictator like some of these other characters. I think that's true, right? That we don't know that, but I think that's true.
Yeah, very, very, very good points there, Andy. Very good points. And we stick to the Trump theme today, because over the weekend, Andy, Trump also had made comments with regards to immigrants about how they're poisoning the blood of the country, Andy.
Yeah.
And then yesterday he doubled down on that by suggesting that people crossing the border illegally in the United States are destroying the blood of our country. They dump them on the border, they pour them into our country, and nobody said to check them. They're destroying the blood of our country. That's what they're doing. They're destroying our country. Obviously, that's a pretty controversial statement. A lot of Republicans have come out against that. Obviously, Andy, the United States is a country of immigrants. We are all immigrants, and obviously, other than the indigenous people here, the Native Americans, but the rest of the country, Andy, we're all immigrants, and so I think this is obviously a very challenging statement for the former president, and it's something that I think you were seeing play out in the races now. But let's focus first on his comments. Any thoughts on his comments, Andy?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good example of what he does very often, which is he'll say one thing and then come back and sort of suggest it's not meant the way that it's being taken, right? So, I mean, he said, they're regarding immigrants, they're poisoning the blood of our country. They've poisoned countries all over the world. They're pouring into our country. And then he says things like, the crime is going to be tremendous. The terrorism is going to be, and he uses these fear, tactics that are usually based on nothing, right? I mean, right now, crime was down in 2023. We haven't had a significant terrorist incident in the United States of America, but he says these things and fires up those that are xenophobic and fearful and want to buy into this. But then he'll come back and say, well, I'm pro-immigrant. I didn't mean to like this or that. And it's just wordplay that he does. And it's, I mean, as filthy immigrant scum, as I am, I appreciate his concern for our country. It's really sad to see that kind of thing, and sad to see how much it's being embraced by individuals, right? But at the end of the day, he uses a lot of hyperbole and fear to get people fired up to support him. And it just doesn't align with reality, right? He paints a picture of America constantly deteriorating, and that's just not true, right? In every respect, things are continually getting better for the most part. And he likes to really play this idea of fear, and only he can save us from, in this case, crazy Joe Biden and the far left. And it's just not aligned with reality. And it's unfortunate to see that he'll pick people and use them, immigrants in this case, others in other cases, to excite his base, to stoke fear amongst the people, because that does create more opportunities for, crime and violence aimed at those groups that he's identifying. And we see that, like we see people getting excited to violence and then carry out violent acts, partially inspired by rhetoric like this. And so it's unfortunate to see. So, having served in 3 combat zones while Mr. Trump was bullshitting around, grabbing, teenage girls' asses or whatever he was doing, I appreciate that he's concerned about America's well-being and disgusted by immigrants. So,
Yeah, again, it's the fear tactics. You hit it right on the point. I mean, it just doesn't align with reality. Unfortunately, people aren't digging. They're not doing the research. They're not doing the analysis to really, fact check Mr. Trump, and they're just going with what he says. And they go, "Oh yeah, I saw that guy. He was arrested, and he must have been an immigrant, and therefore, or they're taking my jobs and they're here illegally, and the reality is that's just not how it plays out, and unfortunately, um, unfortunately, it's just meant to rally that base. But Andy, it is signaling, something that is occurring now that we're starting to see in the polls. I think Iowa is pretty strong on the former president. He's got a good base there. I don't think many people are contesting it, so it's more of a race for second. However, in New Hampshire, where Nikki Haley, we talked about, received a strong endorsement from the governor, Sununu,
Yeah.
recently, and she's got a new bankroll. She's been given a lot of funding from a lot of conservative groups. She has now closed the gap in New Hampshire. I think it was 44 to 29 most recently. So we are within 15 percentage points. And people
Yeah.
may say that's 15, that's still a large thing. But again, this is narrowing the gap. Nikki's not, I don't think, expecting to win these races. She's positioning herself to continue to gain momentum as you go into the larger ones. Again, Iowa and New Hampshire, they may be first, but they're not necessarily huge on the delegate front. You can maximize a lot of things going forward. But what we did see recently, Andy, is the first attack ad from a pro-Trump PAC against Nikki Haley, talking about her role as governor and flip-flopping and such. The content of the attack ad is irrelevant. The fact that the former president or groups aligned with him feel like they have to start attacking Nikki Haley at this point is a strong signal that she's making some waves. So what do you think on that, Andy?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's exactly right. I mean, I think, you can see her rising in the polls. You can see her gaining more financial support. I'm seeing more uh, mailings, so coming from the Haley camp, right? So it's a concern, right? Because while there still is time, right, being the guy at the front of the pack as Mr. Trump is, anything that isn't a dominating victory is going to be spun up, very much as a case against, right, the rising star of Nikki Haley or whoever else it might be against the falling, star, so to speak, of the front runner. We've seen that play out in election after election. This isn't unique to 2024. And she's gaining a lot. I mean, she's getting a lot of support. She's getting attacks from her other, the other candidates as well, because she is emerging as the, front runner to Mr. Trump in the GOP. And so, yeah, Trump's attacking. He attacks well, and I think he sees her as the most serious threat. She doesn't have to win the first few states; she has to do well. And if other candidates fall out, and she starts to absorb some of their support, because presumably, the few percentage that are supporting Chris Christie aren't going to fall to Mr. Trump. Those are supporting the other two candidates, might split somewhere. That gets her a little bit closer, and then if she gets more attention, it becomes maybe a two-dog fight at that point. Moving into the other primaries, that gap could close significantly, right? And so I think there is some concern in the Trump camp. I think there should be, because again, as a front runner, when somebody's biting at your heels, that's a concern. And the Haley camp is doing really well. So interesting to see her rising in the polls. Interesting to see the attacks coming from Trump and others. And I think it all says that she's doing very well for herself. And she's making the case against Trump. She's also started to make a general election case. You're calling out Biden for his age, for example. She's trying to position herself as the alternative to Trump and Biden. It's interesting to see it play out.
Yeah, yeah, and definitely agree. I do think we've been on this bus now for since I think the start of the podcast, Andy.
Yeah.
So it's interesting to see these things start playing out. On the other side of that, Andy, we'll wrap up our politics Wednesday with this last one, Andy. On the other side of that is the turmoil within the DeSantis campaign,
Yeah.
or at least what the bubbling turmoil seems to be. While Nikki doesn't need to win Iowa or New Hampshire. She doesn't even need to finish in Iowa. She may very well come in third or fourth. That's not the point for her. But for somebody like Ron DeSantis, who's invested so much time there, who has got the endorsement of the governor of Iowa, um, he is polling not so strong. In fact, his numbers seem to be going a little bit lower. If he doesn't have a strong showing here in Iowa, there may not be much past New Hampshire for him. In fact, there's been some allegations of improprieties with some of the super PACs that have been aligned against him. So a challenging time for DeSantis, almost in desperation mode, if you can say that before the first before the first caucus. But Andy, what are your thoughts there?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is kind of where his campaign has been, since it started. To Trump's credit, right? Like, say what you want about him, people seem to genuinely like him and enjoy being with him, right? I mean, you've seen him win people over that were vehemently opposed to him for a while. They kind of meet him and he charms them, and they fall in love with the guy. Nobody seems to love Ron DeSantis, right? I mean, people describe him as a jerk, as much worse than that in the way they describe him. And so I think as he does sort of stumble, his campaign isn't going particularly well. People are saying, "Hey, I'm out of here," right? They're seeing either, like, "Hey, let me go support Mr. Trump. Let me go maybe work with the Haley campaign. Let me go do something else." They don't see, his car moving forward very well, and people start to bail. And I think that's what's happening. And so, he's going to, unless he shocks, the world and like wins Iowa or has a really, really strong finish, I think we're going to see, the money's going to dry up, the support's going to dry up. The narrative has already shifted from him as the guy, which he was for a while, right? Everybody was in the DeSantis camp. It's moved away from that. He's the guy that's just still in the race. Nikki Haley is that other candidate. I think things will wrap up pretty quickly for him here in January, and I think that's the end of the DeSantis campaign. And I'm not heartbroken about that in the least bit.
Yeah, I'm not heartbroken either. As a former Florida resident, I can definitely appreciate that this will not be a long lasting run for him. So Andy, let's put a bow on Politics Wednesday. I do want to nominate for our waste wild ass statements, theories, or exaggerations. I do want to nominate Trump's comment about immigrants as a wild ass statement portion of that, Andy. So we can log that as a waste Wednesday. But let's wrap up Politics Wednesday as well. Any before we wrap up the pod in general, any lingering thoughts, Andy? Anything for us to consider?
No, I mean, this has been a heavy 2024 campaign focus today, and there's other things to talk about. I'm sure we'll talk about some of those things. It's just, it's really unique times that we're in right now. I mean, primaries are always interesting. This time of the year, getting ready for those first primaries and caucus is always interesting. Just the dynamic because of Mr. Trump himself, because of these, cases against him, legal cases, the insurrection cases. It's something we've never seen before, right? And underneath it all is this sort of concern of potential violence, right? And it's just a really interesting place in the United States to be, because this isn't how we do things, right? At the end of the day, we have vehement opposition to one another. We have awful, rhetoric against one another. We vote and we move forward. And there's just this underlying feeling of, we're not just going to vote and move forward. And if Mr. Trump loses in the courts or the ballot box, there's concern about what he or his supporters might do. That's just a really interesting time, right? Really strange time for our country. It's worth noting. And one thing I would point out is, while we sort of were very hostile towards the former president, some of this, it's not just him; it's this entire system of politics. We've shared comments about Mr. Biden and others in the past as well. It's just sort of the uniqueness of where we are in 2023. I'm sure we'll continue to discuss these things, Dave. So there's a lot more to cover.
Yeah, it is definitely a unique time, and but I would just encourage everyone. Hey, look, your voice does matter, and get out to vote. I mean, in the primaries, if you have a primary going out, don't think that it's a wasted time or a wasted vote. Everything matters. I mean, you have a right. You've given a right as a citizen of this country to vote, and I think you should exercise that. And even if your person doesn't win, or if they do win. I mean,
Yeah.
it doesn't, I mean, it's not inconsequential. And I think it's really important to get out and vote. So with that, Andy, let's put a bow on that, and we will talk to you next time.